Today we're going to talk about World War I at home. So we've already talked about what's been happening overseas, how the war started. We've also talked about how America got involved in the war, the three causes getting America involved. But what we're going to focus on now is what was going on in the United States while the war was being fought in Europe. And so everything in this PowerPoint lines up pretty closely with the domestic issues worksheet. Basically, especially if you follow the one on the back, pretty much we go in order. The questions not identical, but we go pretty closely in order. So as you're following along, you should have almost everything in this PowerPoint already written down on your domestic issues worksheet. This is just kind of a refresher, or for those of you who would prefer to have a lecture, this is the way we're going to do it. So I always like to start off with a little Snoopy cartoon, the World War I flying ace. You can pause it if you'd like to read. Which brings us to the concept of total war. World War I is considered a total war because it is, and maybe even the first total war, because it's a war where not just military forces are involved. Traditionally, historically, whenever we look at war, the only people involved in war are the military people. In fact, during the Civil War, people used to picnic and watch the war outside of a number of famous battles because civilians were never targeted in early wars. But by the time we get to World War I, World War I is a total war because now civilians are involved in the war effort whether they want to or not. Almost everybody is involved some way or another. Now, of course, there are the direct people who enlist in the military or who are drafted, conscripted, but then we've also got civilians working on the line. Many women will take jobs working in the factories, producing the war materials, and we also have everyday life is affected because of the mobilization of resources. You need to have food, you need to have clothing, and stuff like that is in shortage in the United States and in Great Britain and the other allied countries because all the materials are being sent off to war. So, for example, for part of your life, the war in Iraq, the war in terror, the war in Afghanistan was going on, but it really didn't affect your life. You probably didn't even know that it was going on because all aspects of life were not impacted. But with a total war, you would notice the war is going on because it in some way would impact your life very directly. Eventually, depending on where you lived in World War I, civilians would even become targets of the enemy, especially in parts of France and Germany and Belgium. Civilians were attacked as part of the war effort. And so World War I is considered to be the first total war. So if we want to look at the economic side of war, war is good for the economy. We know that the economy was kind of doing okay before the war. We know that we don't have maybe the greatest thing going on. It's not the worst. It's just kind of steady and stagnant. And then all of a sudden the war happens and we've got to buy a ton of materials for the war. And so things really go well during the war. And this is a good thing for the consumers. A lot of the consumer goods, so things like food and clothing and all that kind of stuff, it goes to pay for the military these days during the war. And so the government gets more involved in civilian life than they've ever been before. We know that America is not a communist country, so generally the government doesn't control the means of production. But by the 1920s, the federal government is going to spend more money buying war supplies than it ever has in history before. That number will skyrocket during World War II again, but so we see the government getting more involved in the economy. Of course, this cost a lot of money. The war cost about $35.5 billion for the United States. Other countries paid a little bit more than that, but America was in at about $35.5 billion, and you had to come up with some way to pay for that, and there were two ways to do that. About a third of the money was raised from increasing taxes, and then 2/3 of the money came from private borrowing. And so if we look at private borrowing, most of that money comes from, you guessed it, selling war bonds. So if we're going to pay for this, we're going to sell war bonds, or what at the time were called Liberty bonds. So here are a couple examples of Liberty bonds. Essentially, you would loan the government money by buying a bond, and then when the war was over, the government would pay you back with interest. And so most of the war was financed by private citizens within the United States. In 1917, the United States came up with the War Industry Boards. Basically, they set quotas for factories. They told factories, if you want the raw materials, if you want the steel, if you want the iron, if you want the things that you need for your factories, you will build stuff for the war effort. And people like Henry Ford were more than happy to oblige. when President Wilson and Congress started to get involved in the economy, the companies were more than happy to do so because they were making money off of it. President Woodrow Wilson also wanted to control inflation during the war, so they set the prices on certain goods, so they fixed the prices, which typically is something we only think about with a command or a communist economy, but we'll do that here. And some areas were taken over by the government, so some industries were nationalized. And again, most industries are pretty okay with this because they're going to make a lot of money over it. The government is going to tell the factories what to make. Today we might have some issues with that, but back then they were making tons of money, so Henry Ford was happy to convert his factories into making stuff for the war. Production during the war went up over 20%. You'll never need to memorize these statistics. You just need to know generally what goes on. But production goes up during the war. But that also means that the price of goods goes up as well because there's a shortage of stuff in America, which is going to lead to high inflation. But that also leads to good profits. The War Trade Board also licensed foreign trade. So if you were going to sell stuff to a foreign country, you had to get the approval of the U.S. government in order to do it. And if you wanted to sell stuff to the enemy, to the Germans or anybody on that side, then you would, well, you go to jail. Other ways they managed the economy is the National War Labor Board, 1918, basically gave an alternative work or fight. So if you didn't go off to war, if you weren't drafted, you had to work in a factory, and if you didn't, well, then you were going to get drafted. And part of this was a way to prevent strikes from happening. A lot of the things that we see today standard in America, like the 8-hour workday, come out of the work or fight mentality. So instead of workers striking and kind of holding the government in an awkward position, saying, you got to pay us more money, the government said, if you don't work for what we're willing to pay, you can go off and fight war. And a lot of people who were staying behind in the factories probably didn't want to do that. So if we look at the average annual income in the United States from 1914 until 1920, we can see that it's going up. But we also see the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or what is the inflation index, is also going up. And so, well, people are making more money, the cost of goods is going up significantly. The cost of most goods will double by the end of the war. And so this creates a lot of what we call inflation. And so, well, wages are going up, so too is the cost of goods, which means pretty much it's a wash, if not inflation goes up. So overall, we get more government involved in the economy. Guess what's pretty important to know? The government gets involved in the economy. Another thing we see during the war is women in the war. So women illegally could not enlist in the actual military. They could not serve in the military proper. But what a lot of women did during the war is they took men's jobs. So when it comes to the war industries, when it comes to working in the factories, typically factory jobs were only taken by men. But now during the war, we're so desperate for people to work, we're willing to let women take traditionally men's jobs. And it turns out they do a really, really good job of it. In fact, sometimes better than the men. Again, you don't need to memorize the numbers, but 13,000 women will join the war operator. Again, you don't need to memorize the numbers, but over 13,000 women will join the war effort. Some of them will work as phone operators, as nurses, as secretaries, in other factories, just doing stuff that men might often do. Here are some of the fun ones. Eventually, these women would be called Rosie the Riveters. They're working in munitions factories. They're actually building those artillery shells that we talked about. So women are doing some pretty high-tech jobs that a lot of times people didn't think women could do because of stereotypes at the time. Turns out women can do them pretty darn well. In fact, sometimes women do the job better than men. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson sees it fitting to reward women for their effort during the war effort. He says, "The service of women during the supreme crisis has been of the most usefulness and distinction. It is high time that part of our debt should be acknowledged." And the way they acknowledge that is by finally giving women the right to vote. We talked about the women's suffrage movement before. In 1918, or eventually what gets passed in 1919, women finally gain the right to vote. So women finally will, as a result of World War II, get the right to vote. So in 1919, the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution is passed, giving all women over the age of 18 the right to vote. Who was working in factories before World War I? Yep, you guessed it, the immigrants. We learned all about immigrants being primarily the people working in factories before the war and especially during the war. And so there's a huge, huge, huge need for immigrants in our country. Most of the people working in the factories are immigrants. But with World War I, we've got less immigration because obviously borders are closed. A lot of those people from Europe who would traditionally come over and work in Henry Ford's factories, a lot of those immigrants, now all of a sudden they're not permitted into the United States. And so one of the things that we see is, again, we need women to work in the factories and we need other people to work in the war industries. And again, don't bother memorizing all the types of things, but munitions plants and steel and shipyards and stuff like that. And so it will be the immigrants who really suffer as a result of the war because they will not get many of their jobs back when the war is over. Another big thing in fighting the war effort is African Americans. We've talked about the Great Migration before. It actually started before World War I starts, but especially after World War I, the Great Migration moves in huge numbers, leading African Americans to leave the Deep South and move to a little bit to the West Coast and especially to the Midwest and the North to take jobs in the North. Now, part of this is because African Americans are sick of Jim Crow laws. They're sick of the discrimination they face in the South. But another big part of it is there are jobs there. Many African Americans are sick of working in the fields. They're sick of the everyday lives that they've been living under slavery in the post-slavery world. And we're not that far removed from slavery by the early 19-teens. And so many African Americans, just to get out of that, they move to the North. Check out this photo. What do you see? What do you see in this painting? Yeah, a lot of it is faceless African Americans. They're going to New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and other places, but just kind of, unfortunately, many of them are going to get ignored when they get to where they're going. You don't see their faces. The Great Migration results in tons of African Americans going to the North. Unfortunately, they don't escape the discrimination the way they thought they were going to. Certainly, life is better in the North than in the South. The discrimination is not quite as bad in the North as in the South. It's certainly not legalized in the North the way it is in the South. But still, there are going to be a lot of racial tensions, a lot of tension between there's going to be a lot of tension between African Americans and white people in the North. And so we see very racist signs like, we want white tenants in our white community, or if Negro men can carry guns for Uncle Sam, surely they can drive milk wagons for Bowman Dairy. Dairy wouldn't hire this guy to work for them simply because he was black. So that being said, if you were African American, would you fight in World War I? Explain why or why not. If you were African American, or if you are African American, said that you wouldn't fight during the war, I know I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't want to defend a country that still had slavery, well, not slavery, but still had Jim Crow laws. A lot of African Americans were divided about what to do with World War I. As you might imagine, W.E. Du Bois, we talked about him before, believed that African Americans should support the war effort, that they should go to war and they should prove to the white Americans that they're worthy, that they're equals. But then there were other people like William Monroe Trotter who said that there's no reason why we should support the American government during World War I. If African Americans were being discriminated against, if they didn't have rights at home, why the heck should they go overseas and fight for the rights of some other country? And so I think it's interesting to see maybe what you would have done. Most African Americans actually followed the teachings of W.E. Du Bois on this one. They actually supported the war effort. They said, look, war is a worthy cause. It's a worthy war. We need to fight this. And we want to prove to the white men that we deserve to be equal. Next, we turn our attention towards rationing. So there is going to be a food shortage during the war. One of the problems is America doesn't have to just feed Americans and American soldiers, but America also needs to feed the British and the French, because by this point in time, a lot of France is bombed out, and a lot of France is in the middle of a war zone. We've got Great Britain. Many of the farmers have left their jobs to go fight on the lines. And so we see the creation of what is known as the Food Administration. America has got to make up for all the food that's not being grown by the European countries. And as a result of that, we have a food shortage in America. We have what is called optional rationing. So it's not mandatory the way it will be in World War II. but people are limited by the amount of food that they can get. So certain types of food, especially sugar and other sweets, they are rationed. You can't buy as much as you want, or at least it's suggested that you don't buy as much as you want. World War II, you'll actually be limited in what you can buy. This brings about what is called the Gospel of Clean Plates. So it was really emphasized that you should never let anything go to waste. Even if you don't like it, you should never leave leftover food, because that's food that could be spent on a soldier. And honestly, my grandfather grew up during World War I. He fought in World War II. But one of the things that he remembers and that he instilled in me when I was a little kid is you never waste food. You never throw anything away. The gospel of the clean plate, if you will. And a lot of this comes from the fact that people were trying to save during the war effort in order to allow more food to go to the war effort, to go to the troops overall. The Food Administration would also encourage what are called victory gardens. People would, in their backyards, plant gardens, and not just because it was organic and safe and healthy to do, like we grow gardens today, but back then the idea was if you were growing your own food, that meant that the food grown by commercial growers could be sent overseas and used for the war effort. Civil liberties. By now you've probably read Schenck versus the United States. When we're talking about civil liberties, we're just talking about rights and freedoms. So those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we talked about in the first unit, those are your rights and freedoms. The right to free speech, the right to freedom of the press, the right to practice your religion, the right to peacefully assemble. These are all things that are protected by the First Amendment. And yet, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think freedoms and liberties of Americans should be restricted in any way, ever? If so, which ones and why? If not, tell me why. Alright, so would you change your mind if you found out our nation was at war? Again, why or why not? What makes things different if you changed your mind? So America did decide that they were going to seriously restrict the freedom of people, seriously restrict the civil liberties of people. The idea in World War I was conformity. You didn't want to speak out against the war. You didn't want to speak out against everybody. You didn't want to say bad things about the war. You just kind of wanted to go with the flow, and that's what people did at the time. Most people, even though their civil liberties were restricted, most people were okay with it because it's going to fight the war effort again. We see a couple things passed. In 1917, we get the Espionage Act, which says it is illegal to interfere in any way with military operations. So anything that could slow down a military operation becomes illegal. Things that you can't do, you cannot support the enemy in wartime, so you can't support the Germans, even though you've got freedom of speech. You can't support the Germans, even though you have a freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. You also can't interfere with military recruitment. So you can't try to stop the draft from happening. You can't protest against people joining the war effort. Which brings us also to the Sedition Acts of 1918. The Sedition Act of 1918 makes it a crime to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government, constitution, military or naval forces, flag or uniform of the United States Army or Navy, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Essentially, you can't say anything bad about the war. And if you do, and you do it in postal service, the postmaster can refuse to deliver your mail. Or if you try to do this and you get caught, well, maybe there are consequences. You, of course, have read the article Schenck versus the United States. You know what happened to our good friend Schenck. He was posting those leaflets. He was protesting the war. He was saying that the war was just for rich people. He mailed these 15,000 leaflets to basically tell people don't join the draft. Some of them got mailed, some of them didn't, some of them got caught along the way, and at the end of the day, he was put on trial for violating the Espionage Act. He's sent to jail, and then he, of course, appeals his case, and then it's up to the Supreme Court to decide what happens to them. Quite surprisingly, the Supreme Court decides unanimously against Schenck. They say that the words present what are called a clear and present danger. They say this is the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And what clear and present danger says, essentially that the Supreme Court says, look, if it were peacetime, what Schenck is doing, telling people that they should enlist in the draft, perfectly okay. But there is a different standard while we're at war. Something like trying to cause people not to join the war effort presents a clear and present danger to the United States. And by that standard, if you do anything that presents a clear and present danger, then you cannot say anything that you want. And we still use this standard today. Probably one thing that you all know is that when you're on an airplane, you cannot say, yep, you guessed it, you can't say bomb on an airplane, because it would create a danger to the people on board. What the Supreme Court is clear about in Schenck versus the United States is that the rules in wartime are different than in peacetime. So just because you can say something in peacetime doesn't make it okay during times of war. We're going to watch a quick little video on Schenck versus the United States.
Just how far does an individual's right to free speech extend? The 1919 court case of Schenck versus the United States was central in defining some of the limitations of free speech rights. You see, during World War I, the U.S. instituted a military draft, in which 24 million men registered and 2.5 million were actually drafted into the military. This generated outrage from certain anti-war groups, such as socialists, anarchists, and peace advocates. Now, President Woodrow Wilson was not a fan of the demonstrations or anti-war literature that some of these groups were generating. Wilson said, "Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." One such protester was Charles Schenck. He was a member of the Socialist Party and was responsible for distributing a leaflet urging recently drafted men to resist the draft. This pamphlet asserted that the draft violated the 13th Amendment, which prohibited involuntary servitude or slavery. He also condemned the federal government and the war. The federal government then arrested Schenck and charged him with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it a crime to obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service. Schenck maintained that the First Amendment's free speech clause protected his right to criticize the government. The Supreme Court took up the question. Unfortunately for Charles Schenck, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him. They argued that wartime circumstances changed the rules related to the right of free speech. The court, in an opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., said, "We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. But the character of every act depends on the circumstances in which it is done." The court also created the clear and present danger rule, a new test for free speech. The court decided the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. From saying bomb on an airplane to yelling fire in a crowded theater, Schenck versus the United States is still applicable today. Clear and present danger would guide free speech conversations until the 1969 case of Brandenburg versus Ohio clarified it further, bringing us imminent lawless action. This would define suppressed.
So if you violated the Espionage or the Sedition Act, you could be punished by up to $10,000 in fine, 5 to 20 years in jail, but very rarely were people actually punished. Over the years, they only prosecuted 2,000 people. Only 1,000 people ever actually got convicted and found guilty of what they did. You don't need to memorize any of those numbers, but just wanted to go to show you that while it is against the law, most people are not going to jail for this because most people, especially early on, support the war effort. Now, we said that early on, especially, a lot of people support the war because they don't know the bad stuff that's going on. There was always this saying that's all's quiet on the Western Front. One of the reasons why everybody thought everything was good and dandy during the war is because everything was being censored, and you couldn't just print whatever you want. You couldn't send whatever you want through the mail. Stuff that was negative was restricted by the government and never made it through. So you got a little Schenck cartoon. All right, so the Committee on Public Information. The Committee on Public Information is the department that creates the propaganda. It is their responsibility to sell the war. And again, you don't need to memorize all the numbers or types of propaganda, but understand that there's over 75 million posters, leaflets, pamphlets, and booklets out there. They even wrote a book that sold over 25 million copies trying to convince people to join the war effort. And so there are a lot of different strategies that are used during propaganda. We'll take a look at a few of these. Number one, evoke strong feelings of patriotism. So you can see Uncle Sam, you can see the flag. Join the war effort because you're proud to be an American. We've got this, which shows patriotism as well. Enlist. Which side of the window are you on? Another strategy is hatred towards the enemy. So this innocent Red Cross person was killed by an enemy submarine, and there's anger towards that. Or help crush the red menace of the sea. So you've got the German submarine, the blood on his hands, the death, red, a symbol of death, that was caused by the Germans. Sometimes you want to make the enemy look evil or inhumane. So we've got Lady Liberty, who is being attacked by some barbarian from Germany. Notice that the traditional helmet of the German military. Or something like this: for the country, my eyes; for peace, your money. The National Loan Consolidation. So look at what the enemy did to this guy. He got blinded in the war, but he's willing to do it. This is how evil the enemy is, and this is the problem that needs to be fixed. We then also have using children to get you, feeling some type of sympathy. Oh, please do, Daddy. Please buy me a victory bond. And you can't say no to your kids. So using kids to sell products is also a common propaganda technique. Other techniques, make those who don't enlist feel cowardly. So even a dog can enlist, why not you? Or emphasize being masculine, emphasize being brave, and basically being a wimp if you don't join the war effort. These are all techniques used to sell the war. Overall, the Committee on Public Information tried to tap into a group mentality, tried to use famous people, actors and actresses and whatnot, to glorify the military life, to make it seem like everything is good in the war. And again, we get that lie: all's quiet on the Western Front, everything's good, join the war effort because it's a good thing to do. What a lot of this stuff doesn't talk about is the negative side of war. There is a lot of propaganda that is used during the war. So another thing you read about is the Spanish flu, or the influenza epidemic of 1918. So we've got something unusual going on. We've got all these people traveling around the world during World War I, people who had maybe never come into contact with a lot of other people before, and now all of a sudden we've got people traversing the world to fight the war. And unfortunately, what this also does is it spreads disease. And we get the spread of what's eventually known as the Spanish flu, or the influenza virus of 1918. By the time we're done, over 500 million people worldwide are affected. That's about 40% of the population of the world. So this is nothing small. I mean, it's going to be huge. And at the end of the day, people end up dying from the flu. And so we're not just looking at, the flu like you get today. You're sick for a couple days. We're talking you get the flu so bad that you may die within a couple days. And in America alone, over 670,000 people died of the Spanish flu. Over 100 million people worldwide died of the Spanish flu. So you can see this is massive numbers in a period of almost about a year. All right, so looking at immigrants during World War I. I want to know, do you know what these people have in common? Yes, they all made classical music, but the other thing they have in common is they are all German. And if you were in a school during World War I, well, you would have been banned from hearing them, because anything German was banned in schools. In fact, there was a huge anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States in general, but especially towards those people who were from the countries we were fighting. So Germany, Austria, Hungary, those countries in the world. So we were always fearful that people here may be spies for another country. Now it turns out that there really weren't all that many German spies hanging out in the United States, but we still restrict immigration seriously during the war. we put huge restrictions on immigration. In addition, there is violence across the United States on Germans and Austro-Hungarians and other people who were fighting against us in the war. Probably the culture was under attack as well. So if we see some things, over 2 million immigrants will lose their jobs as a result of this racism because of the war. Many schools will cancel foreign language classes like German. So speaking Spanish, okay. Speaking French, okay. Speaking German, not so much in schools during the time. And in fact, we even had something like the hamburger got renamed the Salisbury steak because hamburger was named after the Hamburg region of Germany. Now, today we have hamburgers and Salisbury steaks, and they're two different things, but way back in the day, they would have technically been the same thing. So that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully this gives you an insight a little bit more into the culture and what was going on the home front during World War I. Have a great day.